The Sea Fury, the final propeller-driven carrier-borne aircraft to sea service with the Royal Navy. Hello everyone, I'm Matt, this is Model Minutes, and join me on the workbench today as I build and review the Hawker Sea Fury in 1/48 scale from Airfix. For a deeper dive inside the box of this kit to take a look at the paint schemes, decals and plastic parts, check out the dedicated unboxing video I've already made on that topic. In this video I'm going to be building the kit and seeing what it's like at the end. Interestingly, this was actually selected by you, the community, in a recent vote I had on the channel. So to make sure you get the chance to vote on any future subjects and help shape the content, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss out on that opportunity. I'll put a list of the products I used during this build on the screen now to give you an idea of the kind of things to go and get if you fancy having a go at this one for yourself. And without any further ado, let's get into it. As normal, the first step is to remove the parts that I need from the sprue using my cutters. For the small details, I'll potentially use a sharp knife, and once the parts are removed, any rough areas or excess flash can be cleaned up using a sanding stick or carefully shaved away. The moulding is for the most part fairly crisp, but there are a few little bits of flash in a few select places. My glue of choice will be Tamiya extra thin cement during this build, and the first steps were to build up the various cockpit components. This does have a reasonably nicely detailed cockpit straight out of the box, and I would glue the various elements together, such as adding the control panel and the pilot seat to its backrest. This gets added together and creates a kind of cockpit tub, with some side panels replicating other instruments and electrical cables being included as well. And when that was done, it was time to prime. I'm using this generic Hobbycraft black spray paint as my initial base layer for the internal cockpit parts. This would be sprayed over the internal walls and the cockpit assembly I've just created. When that was done, this Humbrol khaki colour would be hand painted onto the seat cushions, and then I would move on to this olive green to paint this other small element as indicated by the instructions. I'm going to use some Humbrol Decal Fix to help stick the included control panel decal onto the correct part. I've already cut the decal from the sheet and soaked it in some warm water, and the application of Decal Fix should help soften these transfers into the control panel and help them stick onto the surface. When that was done, I would paint over the top with some Humbrol clear matte varnish to seal the transfers into the surface. Humbrol number 1 primer grey would be added onto my brush and then removed because I'm going to do some dry brushing. Brushing over the surface of all the details should help highlight them and add some additional contrast. With that done, the cockpit interior could be glued inside one of the fuselage halves. I would also, at this point, add in the tail landing gear bay. This front bulkhead has some supports for the wings, and that can be glued in here as well. And then I would join the two fuselage halves together, making sure I got everything inside aligned correctly. The landing gear bay has a number of components which need to be added. You do get a raised landing gear option in this kit, and if you're going to go for the lowered landing gear option, you have these sort of supports for one of the doors. It's a little bit frustrating that you have to glue it in at this point, because it does mean you can't use the landing gear doors as masks for your landing gear bay because it blocks them from sitting completely flush. There are a couple of small holes here which can be opened up on the inside of this lower wing surface, which will allow the installation of some pylons later on. And here I'm just gluing into place the elements which go in the leading edge of the wing, such as this air intake and the cannon barrels. With that done, this lower portion of the wing would be glued onto the fuselage. That wing support brace we added inside of the fuselage earlier acts as the front of the landing gear bay. Now onto some of the engine parts. This ring needs to have the engine exhausts glued inside of it, and then the cowling can be joined together and attached to this ring. There are some components which represent the engine, and these get glued inside of the front of the cowling, which is then added onto that ring we've just assembled. And then with that done, this engine assembly can be glued onto the front of the model. Turning my attention to the tail surfaces, they come in two halves which need to be glued together, and then they can be inserted into the slots at the back of the model. The elevators come as separate parts, and these can be glued in as well, and they can be positioned. I decided to put mine on in a slightly drooping position. Moving back to the wings now, you do get the option to display these in an extended or folded position. I've decided I quite like the look of mine with the wings extended, so I'm including the parts which will allow me to do this. Firstly, the inboard part of the wings was added, and the fit is quite nice, with a nice flush joint at the wing root. Then after this, the upper surfaces of the outer portions of the wings could be added, and then the model was flipped over and the lower surfaces added as well. I had to take care to get everything nicely aligned here. Again, the ailerons come as separate parts, and these could be positioned if you'd like to do so, but I'm just going to have mine nice and level. There is a footstep for the pilot to use to get into the plane, and this was glued in the lowered position on the bottom of the plane. And this little vent flap can be positioned in an open or closed orientation. I've decided to place mine slightly open. The arrestor hook can be glued into its hole at the back of the aircraft, and then the tail wheel gear bay doors were glued in the open position. There is a clear part for lights on the wingtips, and these were glued in here. And now I can turn my attention to the propeller assembly. The propeller is glued inside of the spinner, and then the back plate is added onto this. The retaining pin is pushed through this disc, and then that retaining pin is glued to the propeller assembly. If you've done this correctly, the propeller should freely rotate, and you don't actually have to install it yet, you can paint it first. Now on to the clear parts. As I identified in my unboxing, unfortunately my clear parts do have a few bubbles in them. I'm not going to do anything to address them, instead I'm just going to continue with the build. I'm going to mask up the clear parts using my normal method, which is to apply tape along the canopy lines, press it down with a toothpick, and then cut along the framework. This should give a nice neat edge. The excess tape could then be carefully peeled away, and I would also make sure to add some tape on the inside because I'm going to paint these separately. I won't add them to the model just yet. You do get a couple of different options for drop tanks in this kit, so I selected the ones I wanted to use and then glued them together. These were then glued into those holes I opened up in the lower side of the wing. You could leave these off for now and paint them separately to make that a little bit easier. And speaking of the painting, I'm not actually going to do any priming. I'm going straight in with this Humbrol Gloss number 15 Midnight Blue. This is actually the colour that Airfix recommends, and I've decided to go for the version in the spray can because I think it would be quite simple to use. I've masked up the internal cockpit areas, and I'm simply going to spray paint the entire model in this colour. A couple of thin coats would be needed to get a good uniform finish. When that was done, I decided I would use this Humbrol Enamel number 81, which is a pale yellow. I thinned it down with some enamel thinners to make it flow a little bit better. This is going to be painted onto all of the internal components for the landing gear bays. This would have definitely been easier to do much earlier on, before I'd painted that blue, as it was quite difficult to cover up the blue paint with it. But seeing as I couldn't mask the landing gear bays with the gear bay parts, due to those support struts being present on the bottom of the aircraft, I thought that this would be the simplest way of doing it. A number of thin coats would be needed to build up the opacity, and whilst it's perhaps not my neatest of work, it's on the bottom of the plane, so you're not really going to notice it in the finished build. With that done, some Vallejo black was used to paint the blades on the propeller, and also the arrestor hook. this gunmetal paint would be used to paint the inside of the engine cowling in an attempt to hit the various details that are inside of there with the engine representation. I would also use this on the panel on the outside of the engine where the engine exhaust comes out. And now we're on to some decals. So in this kit you get 3 different decal schemes to choose from, and I've decided I would go with the Royal Australian Navy. The decals are printed to a lovely quality by Cartograph. I selected the ones that I needed and cut them from the sheet. The transfers were then soaked in warm water to help release them from the backing paper. And if you keep getting your cup of tea confused with your brush water, why not get a brush water mug? Check out the links in the description to my merch store. It really helps the channel. Microset and Microsol are going to be my setting solutions in this build. First up, Microset from the blue bottle would be painted onto the areas where the transfer is going. The transfer, having been soaked in warm water, is then slid into position, and then further applications of Microsol from the red bottle could be applied over the top. These setting solutions help to soften the transfers into the surface details and make them appear as though they were painted on. The decal application process was relatively straightforward, but there was one small problem which I encountered. For some reason in my particular boxing, I didn't have the stencil placement instructions for the version I've chosen to do. This was a bit confusing at first because I didn't understand why the decals I wanted to use were not listed on the instruction sheet. But after some research online, I found that someone on ScaleMates had actually uploaded the correct instructions, and I decided to print them out so I wouldn't get them in the wrong places. A bit frustrating and a bit confusing that for some reason my instructions were not included in the kit for these specific stencils, but if I hadn't have chosen this version, I wouldn't have noticed that they were missing. On the whole though, the decal application process was relatively okay. Perhaps adding the little stencils was a little tedious, but that's just me, I'm not the biggest fan of this. It did take a little bit of time though, and I actually found myself working quite late into the night, and that's when I made a little bit of a mistake. So on the side of the aircraft we've got the 2 roundels with the kangaroos on, and unbeknownst to me, Airfix actually gave them the same identification number, but they are actually handed. That means one's facing one way and one's facing the other way. On the actual aircraft they should be facing towards the nose, but it was late and I was tired and I didn't realise this. I just put them on the plane. It was a 50-50% chance of getting it wrong, and unfortunately I got it wrong. But I didn't notice until the morning, and it was a bit late by then to do anything about it. Oh well, I suppose I best just carry on and scratch it up to experience to make sure that I double check these things and don't do too much work when it's late at night and I'm tired. To help seal in these decals, I'm going to load this Humbrol clear gloss varnish into my airbrush and apply it over the entire model. This should protect the transfers from the next stages. Whilst that's curing, I spray painted the wheels with this Hobbycraft matte black. When that was done, this gallery aluminium marker would be used to pick out the hubs on the wheels. And when that was dry, I glued the landing gear legs onto the landing gear bay doors, and then installed these components into the holes in the bottom of the plane. There are some smaller support struts which need to be glued in as well. This was a little fiddly, and it took a few goes to get them in the correct place. With the various doors and things added to the main legs, the other doors were added into place, making sure they lined up with those support arms which are on the bottom of the plane. For the tail landing gear, the wheel gets pushed onto its leg, and then this gets glued into its slot on the bottom of the plane. I could then repeat this process by gluing in the main wheels on the main landing gear legs. Now, time for some weathering. I'm going to create a very thin wash. This 106 Ocean Grey was thinned down with some white spirit to make a very thin paint. It looked very dark though, and seeing as I want a bit more extra contrast, I then decided to add in a little bit of white to lighten it up. With that done, I painted it over the entire model. It was allowed to run into all the recessed details and panel lines to help add some extra contrast and almost highlight them, giving a bit more depth to the model. Any wash that I wasn't happy with could be carefully reactivated with more white spirit and removed with a cotton bud. The gunmetal paint makes a reappearance here, and I use this to simulate some simple chipping by dabbing it onto the aircraft in various places using a fine brush. I would focus on areas which perhaps would see crew moving around the aircraft during its maintenance, and panels that would often be removed. To add some staining to the aircraft, I'm going to use some of these Humbrol aging powders. These are fine pigments which could be loaded onto a dry brush. I would use the smoke pigment around the engine exhausts, applying it to where the exhaust started and then streaking it backwards in the direction of airflow to simulate a staining effect. I decided that I would only do it to the engine areas though. As this was a post-war aircraft, I doubted the guns had seen much use. Humbrol 24, which is a trainer yellow colour, was carefully painted onto the tips of the propellers. I'd also use it to pick out the end of the arrestor hook. A pitot tube which goes on the wingtip was glued into place, and you can see that I've suitably painted this. And now it was time to remove my masks from the clear canopy parts. These have been painted and decaled separately using the exact same process as the rest of the model. All I need to do is carefully remove the masking tape, and it appears to have done a pretty good job. So with the masks removed, I then removed the sponge and masking tape from inside the cockpit, which has been protecting that area, and then some Humbrol Clearfix was carefully applied to the clear parts to help stick them onto the model. Humbrol Clearfix is a clear glue which shouldn't react with the plastic, but should create a nice strong bond without fogging it up. It can be a little bit stringy though, so I do have to be careful with my application. You could glue the main cockpit canopy in a closed position if you'd prefer, but I opted to have mine in the open position. No pilot is provided in this kit, so it made sense to me to leave it in the open configuration. The final step was to glue the propeller onto the nose of the aircraft, and with that I'm going to call my build of the Airfix Sea Fury complete. And that's another build under the belt. So what do I think of this one? I think it's probably a good idea to talk about the things I didn't like first and then move on to the more positive aspects. So I think first up, the slight quality control issue I had in my kit with the bubbles in the clear parts, a little bit frustrating, but some of the bubbles were on the frames so they aren't visible after painting, but there is one bubble which is visible at the top of the canopy, but if you're not looking for it you probably wouldn't notice it, so it is minor but it's less than ideal. Also there were some slight crinkles in the decal sheet on some of the decals, but fortunately not on any that I was using, so that didn't affect the build at all. Perhaps the most annoying thing about the decals was the fact that my stencil placement instructions were not included in the kit, which was a bit confusing, but I did manage to find a replacement online and printed it out so that I could use it on my workbench. Hopefully these small issues were not indicative of the whole production batch and I just got unlucky. I do find it slightly annoying as well that there was no pilot included in this particular kit, when Airfix have demonstrated that they do have pilots in some of their other products. I wonder if perhaps they don't have a figure sculpted which would depict a naval post-war pilot. Let's move though on to the more positive aspects of this kit. I do quite like the fact that the amount of flash was quite minimal. Any flash that was present was easily removed, and on the whole the moulding is fairly crisp. There are some minor fit issues in a few places, but for the most part the majority of the components fit together absolutely fine, and I didn't use any filler during this build, although there may be a few little areas that could have benefited from it. This kit does come with a number of options, such as the ability to raise your landing gear or display it lowered like I did in this build. Unfortunately I couldn't use the landing gear bay covers as masks because we have those support struts which project from the bottom of the bay, which would prevent them from being placed over the top. We do also have the option to display the canopy open or closed, and the wings can be folded or extended. There is also a number of different armament options such as drop tanks, a photopod, some rockets, and even a rocket-assisted takeoff bottle which can go on the bottom of the plane. Of course this depends on the variant that you're doing, but seeing as this particular kit came with 3 paint schemes to choose from, there was a little bit of choice in here. This isn't the first release of this kit however. The kit I've got here dates from 2023, with the original tooling date of this model being from 2017, so there are a few variants out there. At the time I'm making this video, this kit was available for £34.99 at its recommended retail price. Personally, I think that's a little bit expensive for a 1/48 scale kit. Yes, this kit did have some nice features, but when you compare it to other kits of a similar size, it does seem a little bit more expensive. Fortunately, I did manage to get my example at a reduced discount price in a recent sale on the Airfix website, so I only spent £20.99, which actually is considerably better value. So if you're shopping around and you can find this kit at a suitable price, it's probably worth a go. I think this kit isn't quite up to Airfix's current standards that we expect in 2025 and 2026, given that this is a 2017 tooling. You can see where they were going, but they weren't quite there yet. But nonetheless, it's still a pretty pleasant build, and I would consider getting another one in the future, perhaps to do another version which has more armament on it. One thing I do want to talk about is that paint colour. The Humbrol number 15 I don't think is a particularly suitable colour, it's much too vibrant. It does seem to be a bit more in line with like warbirds that exist today. There is a preserved example which has a much more bright blue colour, but I think in actual service at the time it would have been a much darker blue, similar to the Bearcat that you can see on screen, or perhaps somewhere in between. I think because perhaps Airfix doesn't have a suggested Humbrol colour close enough, they went with the midnight blue, which is a bit too vibrant for my tastes. Also, the fact that I screwed up with the decal on the side. The kangaroos should be facing forwards, as previously mentioned. It actually took me 4 hours to put all of the decals on the kit, and by this point it was nearly midnight, and I was tired, and I just didn't realise that they were left and right specific because they had the same number. So that's a little bit on me, but I think perhaps had Airfix given them separate numbers rather than giving them the same number, this mistake may have been a bit more easily avoided. But you know, I'll take that one on the chin, that's my fault, and perhaps the pilot will just have to fly backwards, so the kangaroo is flying forwards. I do keep a note of all these things that I do in my modelling journal. These are books which I've created specifically to help me on my workbench, and if you'd like to get some examples to help keep a track of your own builds on your own workbenches, check out the links below the video. In here I did make a note that this one took me about 3 days to complete. So all in, it's not an overly complicated kit. And in my case, going for the single colour paint scheme means that I made fairly quick progress in that regards. I think though it's probably time to wrap this one up. This kit isn't exactly perfect, it does have some flaws, which can be overcome, and if you can find it for a good price, it may well be worth a build. On the whole, I enjoyed this project, and I could consider getting another one in the future. Let me know down in the comments what you thought of my build and whether my assessment of this kit was fair. Don't forget that we have got a Model Minutes model club, and if you'd like to join it and get exclusive perks such as early access to videos and other things just like these supporters on screen here, check out the links in the description. Thanks to these members of the model club for the extra support they give the channel, allowing me to create consistent content. Of course there are other ways to help support the channel as well, again information is below the video. The best way to support the channel for free though is by subscribing with notifications turned on so you never miss a modelling upload. Finally though, last thing to say is a massive thank you to you for watching this one, and I'll catch you on the workbench again next time.